Residency. For those of you who are new to our programming, we've given our writers a topic to consider and present to you today. To learn about this year's cohort of writers, visit iwp.uiowa.edu, where you can find biographies and writing samples from our 32 writers from 29 countries and a schedule of our upcoming events. You can also find this information by scanning the QR code on the bookmarks available at the back of the room, and I encourage you also to take the copies of the writers' presentations, catalog for the upcoming Iowa City Book Festival, and most importantly, pizza graciously provided by International Programs at the University of Iowa. And now for today's panel, In and Out of Translation. These essays discuss the nuanced process and results of literary translation. Though literary translation plays a role in global literature, can translation transcend cultural differences? Our format for every panel is the same. I'll introduce the writers going down the list. They'll each give a brief presentation, and then we'll open up to questions. Ikram will be wandering around with the microphone. Please don't begin to ask your question until he reaches you with that microphone, because we want to be sure that the audience watching on YouTube can hear you as well as those in the room. Please speak slowly and loudly to ensure that this presentation is accessible. Now, to the writers. Immediately to my left is Felipe Franco Munhoz, a fiction writer, poet, playwright, and translator from Brazil. He's the author of Dissolutions, 2024, Lanternas to Nirvana, 2022, Identities, 2018, and Lies, 2016. He has translated works by Turgenev, Samuil Marshak, and Pushkin. He's the recipient of a Santa Maddalena Foundation Fellowship and residencies with Art Omi, Sangam House, and the Festival Artes Vertentes. His participation in the Fall Residency was made possible by the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Next to Felipe is Zakaria Amataya from Thailand, a poet, editor, and translator. He won the 2010 SEA Write Award for his first poetry collection, No Women in Poetry. He followed with a second collection, But in Us It Is Deep as the Sea, in 2013. And after 25 years in Bangkok in India, he returned home to Narathiwat in 2016 to write poems and stories about the southern Thai borderlands and to co-found a journal called the Malaya Review. His third poetry collection, due out this year, is called Posthumous Poems from Paradise, and his participation in the Fall Residency was made possible by the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Next to Zakaria is Yassine Adnan, a poet, fiction writer, editor, and TV presenter from Morocco. He's the author of 6 poetry collections, 3 short story collections, a novel, and a book about travel. The novel, Hat Merek, was published in English by Syracuse University Press in 2021. Adnan serves as president of the Marrakesh English Book Festival and is a member of the Board of Trustees of the International One Prize for Arabic Fiction. The founder of 2 literary magazines, he has also hosted 2 cultural TV programs, 1 radio show, and a podcast. He's the editor of various titles, including the anthology Marrakesh Noir, which came out in 2018, and his participation in the Fall Residency was made possible by the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Finally, we have Nurit Kazatlan, poet, fiction writer, editor, and bookseller from Argentina. She's the author of the novel Tanto, which came out in 2023, and was the recipient of an honorable mention for the National Award for Literature from the Fondo Nacional de las Artes. And the poetry collections, Movimentos Incorporados 2007, and Lógica de los Accidentes, 2013, and Después in 2018, which was published in English by the Cardboard House Press as awaiting major events in 2021. She attended the Campo Garzón residency in Uruguay in 2022, and her participation in the Fall Residency was made possible by the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Felipe, the floor is yours.
I'd like to thank the International Writing Program, Christopher Merrill, Shelley Criswell, Kate Dickery, Monique Galpin, Mike Magnins, Julieta Rangel Gomes, and Ikram Basra, also the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Embassy in Brazil, and the U.S. Consulate in São Paulo, and to thank you all and my fellow here. Around 8 years ago, I started studying Russian because a friend of mine who teaches Russian mentioned she was short of students. I would never say I fell in love with the language, but when you start learning a new language, any language, you open unexpected windows, and you start learning different ways to read the world. I could never imagine that this Russian window would make a translator out of me, and from this open window, a few unexpected leaves would fall onto my own blank pages. In 2020, during the very beginning of the pandemic, my two-dimensional theater teacher suggested I translate as homework, as a challenge, a couple of Alexander Pushkin's verses from one of his most well-known poems. The professors who taught the punk rebellious kid I was in school and university would be surprised. Not only did I do the homework, but went as far as to translate the whole poem. Because with Pushkin's language, with Pushkin's music, beauty and precision, Pushkin's sagacity, sarcasm and pain and lust and passion, I was actually falling in love. The majority of Pushkin's poems are written in iambic meter, which means that every other syllable is stressed. The majority of Pushkin's quartets are composed by a rhyme with an oxytone word and a rhyme with a paroxytone word, randomly distributed within the 4 verses. The first of the quartet's pairs of the poem in question, in this case, an iambic pentameter, each verse composed by 10 poetic syllables, is Я вас любил, любовь еще быть может, в душе моей угасла не совсем, но пусть она вас больше не тревожит, я не хочу началить вас ничем. Beyond figuring out what was written in the poem, the goal I found joy in pursuing was to recreate the pattern in Portuguese, to dissect it with a melody's scalpel, and to rebuild it with distinct bricks. I built it and I destroyed it, and again, and my first Pushkin quartet, survivor of 1,000 versions, became Amei você amor talvez que ainda aqui de todo não se desgastou, porém retiro o estorvo, angústia finda, poupar-lhe de qualquer tristeza eu vou. By then, in lockdown, I was already writing a book that would be my 3rd book, Lanternas on Nirvana, in which I was making an effort to carve multiple characters, points of views, and attitudes regarding the pandemic. My own writing, blurring boundaries, combining drama, poetry with fixed forms, visual poetry, images, etc., to compose with fragments a kind of a narrative arch, is more connected to avant-garde movements. Meanwhile, for almost all fragments, breathing with an Oulipo lung, I'm always pushing myself to pre-establish a restriction, always trying to match form and content related to the fragment's atmosphere. A fixed form usually forces the writer to discard first ideas that usually are the last interesting ones. To count syllables, to pen for rhythm and rhyme was part of my routine. And after the Russian class challenge, hooked by Pushkin, even though most of the time I felt as if I was a completely lost Bill Murray, it was difficult not to translate more of his poetry. So, For the rest of the 312 days that I didn't leave, not once, the apartment where I was living in, I was working in and out of translation, writing my own book and allowing Pushkin's voice to merge into my literature, and transcreating Pushkin's verses, having to cut words, to invert sentences, and even to add some beat parts. Out of translation. Consciously, I allowed Pushkin's voice to merge into my writing, but in a sense that I was both applying his traits and exploding them, and mixing them with stage directions, and enveloping them with soundtracks. In translation. About Pushkin translation, since there are millions of possible paths to translate any literary work, no translation is definitive. Mine is only one approach. It's as if a reader of Portuguese that can't reach Pushkin in Russian could read Pushkin's voice through the filter I'm suggesting through my voice. Out of translation. About my own writing, perhaps the most interesting thing, after all, is that Lanternas ao Nirvana wouldn't be the same book as it is if 8 years ago I didn't open the Russian window, and if a little later I wasn't hooked to Pushkin's tone. It's evident that it's impossible to tell how it would be without Pushkin, but I'm sure that now, when I face a blank page, there he is, along with a mosaic of other authors' eyes, artists whose language I love. Pushkin's eyes are sharply facing me back.
Hello. In and out of translation. Without translation, we will be living in province bordering on silence. George Steiner. It happened when I was studying Islamic science, Arabic language, and literature at Darul Ulum Nadwatul Ulama in Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh, India. It was on the first day of the last semester of my undergraduate study that my Maulana, or master, asked everyone in class, after graduating, what are you going to do? Some of my friends replied that they will be start a worldly career, but most of them say they will serve as a religious duty by becoming an ustaz or religious teacher. My Maulana then turned to ask me. I stood up and said, I will be abridged. Then I remained silent as my master looked at me with wonder and doubt, while all my friends were quiet as a grave. After a few moments, I explained that I want to be a bridge that connects between one people to another, a bridge that crosses from one language to another. As I was saying this, in my head, I mean I wanted to become a translator, translating books or words or any writing text. After my graduation, I returned to Thailand and continued my study in comparative religion. I also started reading and writing poetry in various original languages. Namely, I read Arabic, Malay, and English. I read and translated some of these poems. The more I did this, the more experience I gained in translation, and unknowingly, and little by little, I realized that my translation functioned as a bridge not only between those languages, but also a bridge that connected myself to adventurer as a poet who writes in the Thai language. Let me give a background on Thai poetry. We have a long history of poetic verse. Thai poetry dates to Sukhothai period, 13th to 15th centuries, and flourished under Ayutthaya, 14th to 18th centuries. The Thai poetical medium consists of 5 main forms, known as Klong, Chan, Kaap, Klon, and Rai. Almost all have rule governing the exact meter and rhyme structure. So we, Thai people, are very proud of Thai poetry. In school, we learn how to compose poems in traditional classical form. But school don't teach modern poetry or free verse poetry, of which I am practitioner. Most Thai poets write in traditional form, maybe just 22% or 30% write in the modern form. So why is translation of modern poetry of any language to Thai language very important to our readers? To me, I think a poet can learn a lot from studying translation, but translating out to a different language and translating into our language. To elaborate on this, can translation transcend cultural difference? I do not believe that translation can completely transcend the original work, but I think it can connect some cultural difference. However, I believe we need to try to transcend across this space. A week ago, I joined an international translation workshop. I found that my poem, posthumous poem from Paradise, was hard to translate into English because there are gaps in cultural difference that cannot be crossed, something more than words that cannot be reached through the other language. Still, Kokotek and me, I work hard and try to our best to bridge those gaps. As I am talking to you right now, I am also translating my own thought into English, struggling to cross the bridge in my head and my heart, the bridge that I sometimes fall under. Then I struggled to climb back on it again. And fruitful from translation of my poetry out into English, that bring me here to International Writing Program. At last, let me recite a poem in my language. อะไรสักอย่างมันต้องมีอะไรสักอย่างในจักรวาลนี้ที่พัดหลงไปจากมิติการเวลาอะไรสักอย่างที่โคลัมบัสและลิวิซิสตกสำรวจอะไรสักอย่างที่นักดาราศาสตร์กรีกและอาหรับมิได้ค้นพบอะไรสักอย่างที่ศาสดาของโลกลืมเทศนาสั่งสอนอะไรสักอย่างที่ขาดหายไประหว่างหลุมดำมันต้องมีความผิดพลาดบางอย่างเกิดขึ้นระหว่างรอยต่อของเผ่าพันธุ์มนุษยชาติที่พัดหลงครั้งน้ำท่วมโลกอะไรสักอย่างที่ไม่ได้ไปพร้อมกับเรือโนอาห์อะไรสักอย่างที่พระคัมภีร์โบราณมิได้จารึกอะไรสักอย่างที่นอสตราดามุสคาดไม่ถึงมันต้องมีความเข้าใจผิดบางอย่างบนโลกใบนี้ที่สูญหายไปจากฐานข้อมูลของพลโลกอะไรสักอย่างที่เพลโตไม่คาดคิดอะไรสักอย่างที่นิตเช่ไม่ได้กล่าวถึงอะไรสักอย่างที่ไอน์สไตน์ไม่ได้คำนวณอะไรสักอย่างที่ ที่ขาดหายไป the missing there must be something in this universe that has strayed from the dimension of time something Columbus and Ulysses misses in their exploration something Greek and Arabian astronomers failed to discover something the world's prophet forgot to preach something that vanished between the black hole of space. Some mistake must have occurred between theme of the human race that went missing at the time of the flood, something that failed to board Noah's Ark, something unrecorded in ancient Hollywood, something Nostradamus forgot to predict. There must be some misunderstanding on this earth that has been lost from the archives of humanity, something that Plato did not anticipate, something Nietzsche failed to mention, something Einstein could not calculate. Something is missing.
On literary translation, scattered thoughts and paradoxes. Since the first complete translation of Antoine Gallant's The 1001 Nights into French appeared in 1704, followed by successive translations into English, German, Danish, and other languages, Arab culture has been transformed. The 1001 Nights, which in our Arab countries was considered a marginalized oral folk text, not counted as high literature, has become a unique, intriguing literary reference in many languages, cultures, and among various peoples. I can point to its great influence on a number of English writers, such as Sir Walter Scott, Lord Byron, John Keats, and Thomas More, so as to just name a few of them. There are even those who crowned it the first Arabic book. Thus, the Arab literary establishment was forced to change its position on the book, not from literary conviction, but because of the power of translation, and under the direct influence of the strong echoes of the translations of the Nights. I wish to start with this example because it illustrates how translation can affect not only the recipients and receivers in the target languages, but also the literary consciousness of the environment from which it is translated. In short, it was the translations and Western reception of the 1001 Nights that revived in the Arab creative consciousness and that revived it in the Arab creative consciousness and forced our official literary establishment to come to terms with and rehabilitate this work. When we receive a good piece of news, we say in English that the news is heartwarming, and the same in French. Les bonnes nouvelles réchauffent le cœur. But if we translate this phrase into Arabic literally, word for word, the result will be bad and unpalatable. In Arabic, we say, هذا الخبر يثلج الصدر, which means, literally, that great news ices my chest. In the hot countries of the Arab world, cold and ice are a source of refreshment, unlike in the languages of cold regions where people enjoy warmth, which creates feelings of pleasure and happiness. So sometimes a translation has to betray the original structure in order to convey the meaning, intent, and connotation. In Morocco, my country, translation is a sensitive topic, almost related to national reconciliation. We have two elite groups in the country, one that writes in Arabic and one that writes in French. Each group has its own socioeconomic, intellectual, and ideological background, and its own audience and readers. Unfortunately, we do not possess any institution, fund, or national translation mechanism which allows us to translate our works from Arabic to French and vice versa. We ask for this, not for the sake of literary popularity, but so that Moroccans can read their writers in both languages and complete the circle of reception. This would contribute to national linguistic reconciliation, which would undoubtedly reduce social misunderstandings and reflect positively on the general consciousness of Moroccans. Translation can play a key role in this regard. However, there is a harsher paradox for Moroccan writers who write in Arabic. They have little luck with translation. This is because publishers of books in a number of languages can only or are only interested in Arabic literary works after they have been translated into French. I don't know why English, American, and German publishers have such blind faith in their French counterparts. I can't find a plausible excuse or justification for it. But what is even more surprising is that French publishing houses, in the limited quotas they allocate for translating Arabic literature, look for works from Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and the Gulf countries, and generally exclude works from the North African Maghreb. But why? Because they consider that Moroccans, Tunisians, and Algerians write directly in French. Therefore, they don't need translation. This is how we, the Arabized writers of the Maghreb, are condemned to permanent house arrest in our mother tongue. For example, the prestigious French publisher Actes Sud, in its collection of Arabic literature, has translated only 3 Moroccan writers. I'm fortunate to be one of them, the last to join with my novel Hot Maroc. If it were not for that, I might not have crossed over into English, and my novel would not be on display on the shelves of Prairie Lights bookstore today. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks everybody for coming here, and thanks UEWP for everything and my embassy. I would like to thank also Wendy for helping me with my pronunciation, and my translator, Maureen Shaughnessy. I will dedicate this piece to her, even though I translated it, but it's okay. In and out of translation, things I discovered through the process. I believe in fate. I know this might be a polemical sentence for a writer to say, but I do. It usually means that things happen for a reason. So I must believe that even though I wanted to speak about nature and how a landscape can shape the way you see life and mold our own literature, for some reason, I am supposed to speak about translation. When we went to the art exhibition at the Stanley Museum, the Korean artist emphasized not to be too comfortable in what you're doing well. So maybe nature is an old topic for my writing. It's been 1 year since my novel was published, and I have a new novel in my head. It's about a woman who is emptying her dad's mother's house, and I'm not yet sure about the shape it will take, or if it's going to be an autofictional novel or not. When I started writing it, I decided the main character will work as a translator and that I will combine autobiographical facts with some translation theory. Because what usually happens when you are in mourning is that you lose your own language and the way you used to name things is no longer possible. And at the same time you are reconstructing yourself, you need to find a new way of naming things. For this panel, I decided to share with you two experiences about translation, one about being translated and the other one about being a translator. It is a fact that translation complicates the authorial position, usurping it and dislocating it. For me, the book, the end result, once translated into another language, belongs to the translator. As a poet whose work is being translated, one can only intervene when one feels the original intention is not being respected. Surprisingly, the translator will often opt for an unexpected linguistic turn of phrase or for a word that is a part of a determined idiolect. They will have their reasons, and a poet must trust their translator. I recall a short essay by Anne Carson, Variations on the Right to Remain Silent, in which it says, every translator knows the point where one language cannot be translated into another. For Carson, this proves that languages are not science of one another. You cannot match them item for item. Once we can rule that the intention behind translating a poem is its communicability, once we can agree in advance that the poem will never be the same as the original, this is when sonority can take on more significance than meaning, or vice versa. Perhaps it is only when translating from one language to another that untranslatable expressions appear, and this reveals the specificity of poetic language. As the Uruguayan poet Circe Maya says, the word translation itself is misleading by assuming the notion of transferring something from one side to another, for example, the poem itself, from one language to another, and naturally, this doesn't make any sense. Ultimately, the key is not understanding that some things will not be transferring, but rather accepting it. In the end, nothing is actually transferred. In my case, being translated gave me the chance to realize the importance of the image in my poems. In the poem, Love Might Arrive Later, I was faced with a question by Maureen, my translator, about whether Sueño Interrumpido referred to a couple whose future project together was ending. I did have that in mind, but what was really more important to me was the physical image of disrupted sleep in the poem, not the intangible idea. I wanted to show the image of a couple in bed together and her waking up several times throughout the night because she can't sleep. The meaning of sueño is something concrete, like the English word sleep, as opposed to the other meaning, dream. I decided it was more important for the reader to visualize the image of something tossing and turning during the night. And if that meant losing the idea that the couple's project was ended, I was okay with giving that up. Carson said, there is something madly attractive about the untranslatable. Personally, translating and thinking about translation problems reminds me of solving mathematical equations. I've been reminded of when the philosopher Hölderlin called translation a salutary gymnastic of the mind. I think translation is one of the most immersive works in which the self is committed. Thinking back to our collaboration, we drove ourselves nuts looking for a solution to the English word crave. Crave is one of those English words that doesn't have such a straightforward translation, like saudade, which is nostalgia, in Portuguese. For me, words like this have a physical connotation. Translating also means embracing the fact that one is going to lose. In addition to the transmissible, all languages possesses something impossible to transmit, something that bobs around in your head with no resolution in sight. The translation must first focus on creating a similar effect in our language, taking great care to maintain the architecture of the stanzas, despite the extreme complexity of the image, says Circe Maya. But translating also means trusting in language, trusting that the translation will help us to open our own senses. In the poem, all leakage is an illusion. We try to find the right translation for fuga, so that in addition to an electrical leakage, it will offer reference the idea of escape that comes from nominalizing the verb fugarse, to escape. We were both highly aware that these double meanings, or lack thereof, are always lurking about. In English, there is no single word that can suggest both meanings at the same time. There is no way to allude to this semantic ambiguity. We finally accepted this defeat. In English, we could not find the ambiguity that this verb has in Spanish, and we decided to respect image rather than idea. That is, only the electrical sense of the word fuga remains, not the idea of escape. Again, images in my poem takes one more importance over the ideas. When one translates, the minds enter into a different state in which the common sense, in which the common impressions of reality become deformed. Translating, like dancing, enables one to purely inhabit the moment, a here and now in which only exists the original poem and the poem that will become the end as a result. The first time I decided to translate a living author was when I heard Aziya Wadood in a rooftop poetry reading in Brooklyn. There were 4 poets, but when she read, something happened to me. I was drawn by the musicality of her words. Maybe it was one of those times when poetry hit you in the gut. And within a minute, I felt like I wanted to translate her. Later, I sent her a few versions. I use the word versions on purpose because I think it's impossible to put an end to a translation. Translating is also making decisions all the time. If we want to say one thing, we lose another. Following not so much what the poem says, but what the poem does with language. I chose a series of poems from a book called Cross-like for a Young Bird. It was quite difficult to do, as there are neologisms, phrases in other languages, and references that I didn't know about at all. For example, Newbird refers to a girl, Nana, from a Syrian documentary that I didn't have access to. But at the same time, it also refers to a young and innocent bird. Her poetry is full of ambiguities that enrich the text, but make it difficult to translate. There is a very strong political undertone in the poems, like an urgency, which comes through in the language used. It is as if the language were broken, because plain language will not be enough to explore the edge, the border, the crisis of political refugees, and the problems of migration. The use of repetition in the poem is a kind of insistence of repeating names as is not to forget them, as if the anaphora of the voices were inscribed in the lineage of poems of denunciations. Throughout the book, ekphrases appear interspersed with questions about language, about the mother tongue, about the language we carry with us and the one we speak socially. In translation, the fact that the poems are governed by the principle of rhythm is somewhat lost. But even though if we fail, even though if language will never be the same, it's worthy. Perhaps the ultimate example of how translating is impossible could be illustrated by London-based poet Caroline Bergal's experimental performance Via, which includes 48 versions of the translation of the first 3 lines of Inferno from Dante's The Divine Comedy. None is exactly the same as another. Translation could be an infinite exercise. Having access to a living author when we are translating perhaps is one of the ways to help us reduce the endless possibilities. Thank you.
What a great set of translations. Thank you all. And while you are formulating questions in your mind, let me tell you a few things about upcoming events. Join us at Prairie Lights, aforementioned by our friend Yassine, on Sunday at 4 p.m. to hear Sarah Anjumbari, an MFA candidate in the nonfiction writing program, Fodiso Morira from Botswana, and Daryl Lee from Singapore. On Tuesday, October 8th at 5 p.m., we will host a reading at the home of the IWP, the Sangam House, on 430 North Clinton Street. This reading will feature Pervin Saket from India, Yutin Sawanishi from Japan, Hatis Agikosh from Germany, and Olina Husaneva from Ukraine. On Wednesday, we will have a Global Express, an evening of theater and writing at 7:30 p.m. in the Alan McVeigh Theater on campus. For this event, IWP writers provide short works which are adapted for the stage. See the fruits of this annual collaboration. And finally, we will be back here next Friday, here at the Iowa City Public Library at noon for our panel, The Writer's Voice in the Reader's Ear, with writers from Bangladesh, Japan, the PRC, and Germany. So, to the questions. And a reminder to speak slowly and loudly.
Hello. Nurit kind of brought this up about like untranslatable sort of words or phrases in languages. Like anybody who's sort of started learning a language, you kind of come across those. I knew they existed in English, I just didn't know any words like that. Are there any particular like untranslatable words or phrases in the languages you primarily write in that like you particularly like for everyone?
What a good question. Yeah.
There were some words difficult to translate into Portuguese when I was translating Pushkin. And I put a lot of footnotes in the book. Some of them I tried to find, to approach the meaning somehow, but some other times I kept the word in Russian and I add some footnote. And I like books with footnotes, and I think that it can help the reader, and that was my solution for this case, because I'm not a professional translator. I translated this book, and there are two others that are coming out, the Turgenev and the Marshak one, but I'm not like available for translate a lot of work, so this was the solution for this specific case. So, and I don't know how I would react in other cases.
I don't know. It's a very difficult question, in fact. But I know that in all languages, I mean, there are some words that are not but language. There is some essence that is very difficult to transport to the target language. And I don't mean here the connotation. All words have different connotations. I'm thinking about something else. And I remember one French translator was living in Marrakesh, and he was working on the Quran, the Islamic holy book, and some mystic texts. And he finished by writing a book. He has published his book, he's French, he has published the book in français with the title Les larmes du traducteur. What is les larmes in English?
The tears.
Tears of translators. So, I mean, it's as if it was an impossible mission to translate and to give exactly, I mean, these vibrations, these cultural vibrations of words.
Even the title of the book, Pushkin book I translated, is The Bronze Horseman. and it's widely known as that, but in Russian is more close to copper, not bronze. So it was we were in doubt, me and my editor, if we should keep the bronze. So in Portuguese it became o Cavaleiro de Bronze, like the bronze horseman, as it is widely known. Or if we should like change it to the copper horseman. But we decided to keep as it is like known worldwide.
I would like to answer with a poem. Sorry for looking at the cell phone, I was just looking at the poem. The logic of accidents. If I could understand the order that leads to accidents. The logic of accidents. If I could understand the order that leads to accidents, the laws of what's given, the unequal distribution of anguish, writing a word like ansia, desiring, longing for, urgently needed, but there is no translation, there is no logic, except in the body. So that's the English poem, and really that what happened to me was with the word crave in English. I saw a play by Sarah Kane, which is a British playwright, and the play was called Crave, and I really fell in love with that word, because I think crave is one of the words that you cannot translate, because it means all of the things. So I write a poem to try to understand that.
Okay, I have one point on this. I am more than bilingual. For my mother tongue is in Malay, and second language is Thai and English and Arabic. I learn Arabic. So I want you to recommend to read Paul Celan poetry. Paul Celan from Austria. Celan say poetry look like a message in bottle, and you throwing in the sea. And sometimes this bottle will going around, maybe it will be in some shore. Maybe some people pick up, maybe some people don't pick up. And some people pick up and open it. And maybe read, or maybe not read, or maybe they read and not understand anything. So poetry itself, when we're thinking something, we translate it into any language what we have capacity to write down, like me. A few weeks ago, some professor in history, he want to write about my last book, Posthumous Poem from Paradise. He asked me about what are you dream in your, what language of you dreaming in your sleep. So I replied by message to him in Bangkok. I think I always dream by the language that I used to thinking in my head. So my literary language is Thai language. So I think my dream should be in Thai, because I should think something deep in Thai language. So like when I want to write down this paper for this panel, I should not think in Thai. I try to think in English, but my English is not so good. But so I think if you read some poem of Paul Celan, I think Paul Celan is the second one after Rilke in German language. I love poem of Paul Celan because it's very hard to me to understand. Thank you.
Zachariah, that makes me think the Serbian-American poet Charles Simic, when asked a similar question, said, I write and dream in the language I speak with an accent.
I'd like to give a comment to the Thai writer Zachariah. When you were reading out the last poem in your native language, it appeared to me that you were saying the word orisikia, orisikia, orisikia. Is that right? Does that mean something? It sounded like that. In Hindi, that would be or aise kya, which is like, and How about that? So it was very interesting to hear you speak the poem versus looking at it in English. I'm just saying that the reader or the listener has a very different experience regardless of the meaning of the poem in a different language. The question that I want to pose to each of you is that using Zakaria's bridge metaphor, bridges take time to build. Bridges are also torn down. Over a passage of time, is it easier to translate when something has already been translated, or is it easier when it's brand new?
Great question. Who wants to start?
Okay. I'm starting right now poetry when I understand the lesson of my professor in India. I'm studying Arabic. First year and second year, I just listen the voice of professor but not understand anything. But so that time I start compose my poetry. I don't know what is poetry or not, but something like I want to tell myself because I understand anything the class. So I think the question is again the question.
Well, over a period of time, is it easier?
The bridge. Okay, I remind the bridge. When I came back to Thailand, I start study and I start translation because I want to read a poem, not Thai poem. So I must read, maybe when I want to read the Fernando Pessoa, I cannot read in Portuguese, I read in English. And sometimes I translate it in Thai language, and sometimes Paul Celan, I don't understand the Germany, but I read in English from Latin American, but in Arabic I translate direct to Thai. So during my translation, I'm not aware before, but after that, my language changed already, becoming like the poetry. The content of poetry is belong to Paul Celan or Fernando Pessoa or Garcia Lorca or Pablo Neruda, everyone. But the language is my language, not Thai language properly, but new language that I build a bridge, new bridge for me. So when people read my translation or read my poem by myself, they will know this is Zakaria's style. This is bridge of Zakaria, something like that. Yes, what I want to say.
In my case, I think my answer is a paradox because I think sometimes the more you know, it's easier, but sometimes it's bad because you become more specific. You know more neologisms, more idiolect, and you know more things how to say a word. For example, when I don't speak very well English, and since I arrived here, I'm becoming better, and I think like. I don't know, like you of course you translate better because you get in touch into language and you read more, but on the other hand, it's like you are getting to understand that it's impossible, and it's both. I think it's both. I think that's why translating is so magic, because even though, is that what I say, even though you know you are gonna fail, you do it anyway. And even though sometimes you're not better at it, you are getting worse, but you do it because you want to feel the language in the point in your language. It's like you need it.
I would just react with two things. I mean, when Zakaria was talking about Fernando Pessoa, there is a Moroccan poet and translator who translated Pessoa, the whole Pessoas, to Arabic from Spanish. And he was criticized because of this, especially in the most important Arab literary newspapers, famous ones in the Arab world. But afterwards, everybody was referring to him and learning Pessoa from him. Now, his translation of Pessoa, incontournable. You just cannot disregard it in the Arab world, though it is not from Portuguese. No one in the Arab world will translate directly from Portuguese. So translation, in a sense, I mean, it can serve even to translate from. And it can become a part of your own literature. And here I will refer to Goethe. In 1808, someone was preparing an anthology of German poetry at the time. I'm talking about a time when Germany was colonized by Napoleon Bonaparte. And he told Goethe, okay, can you suggest for me some important poets that I need to have in my anthology? He told him, try to have some important Persian and Arabic translations in your anthology, because I cannot imagine German poetry today without them. And you all know about the Oriental Divan of Goethe. Divan, this is an Arab Persian word, which means that you cannot get rid of translation. It's a part of your own poetry.
In my case, when I'm translating, I avoid to look at other translations of the same thing, to not, because if some translator finds a good solution, maybe it will be difficult to find a different one. So I try to find my solution firstly, but afterwards, when the work is finished or almost finished, I try to double check with the language in which I can read the same thing, or other translations to Portuguese. But just to double check the content, and if I made some mistake, then I think it can be useful. But in my case particularly, I don't like to look to other translations.
And I might just add, speaking of Ceylon, it was an IWP writer, Pierre Joris from Luxembourg, who devoted 50 years of his life to translating the whole of Ceylon. It comes out to almost 700 pages. And I think that the bridge he was building between German and English, between Ceylon and English-speaking readers, took time to build, 50 years, and he got better and better as the years went on. Other questions?
Yeah. Thank you all.
Can I just interrupt to say, we've got to make it quick. We've got about 2 minutes, so.
All right. Nurit, you spoke about, when you were talking about your relationship with your translator, you said a poet must trust their translator, which as a translator is lovely to hear. And this is a question that any of you can answer, I guess, like, what makes you trust a translator? Like, where does it come from? How do you decide that you trust a translator?
Well, in my case, I didn't know her before the book came, but then we became friends. But we talk about words a lot, and I think translating is also writing. It's like writing a new book, and I think the book is not mine, it's hers. I told her one time, we were talking on the phone, and I told her, it's your choice. I can let you know what the word means to me, I can explain you the context, but at least it's her work, it's her experience, and I think it's, you trust or you don't trust. I trust. I'm like that.
No, I mean, trusting. I will just react to you Americans. You trust French translators and translations. I'm not talking about my case. I'm talking about William Faulkner. If he was not translated to France, and I mean, critics were interested in him in France, I mean, it's then that you started saying, wow, he's a great writer, and you started reading William Faulkner.
Yes, but remember, they also think highly of Jerry Lewis. And
the last, I want to thank to many of translators in America that they translate many books of poetry around the world, and many of university like Texas University, and I think Iowa also, and many Yale University, and they have many programs on translation. I think this make more knowledge, because I cannot have a time to learn 10 languages for my life. So just I read in English, enough. And Arabic, and Malay, and Thai, just 4 languages for me.
It's a lot.
What a fabulous panel. Thank you so much.